Wonderful. So I think with that, we're going to get started with tonight's event. So good evening and good morning to all of our friends from all around the world. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Indigo Talk. And actually, I believe it's our first public virtual event of the year. So we're so excited. And though I can't see your faces, I see many familiar names in the participant list and also some new friends as well. So welcome and welcome back. And my name is Lillian, and I'm the program manager here at the Ikeda Center, and I will be the moderator for today's event. So for our friends who are new to the center, I thought I'd start out by sharing a little bit about our work and our mission. We were founded in 1993 by Daisaku Ikeda, who is a peace builder, writer, educator, and Buddhist thinker. Mr. Ikeda was a teenager when Japan entered World War II, and he experienced firsthand the sufferings and tragedies of war, including losing his own brother. Since then, he has dedicated his life to the pursuit of peace through education and dialogue, establishing schools all around the world and engaging in heart-to-heart dialogues with thousands of leaders, thinkers, and ordinary citizens. After his second lecture at Harvard University in 1993, he established the Ikeda Center with the hopes that it would be a spiritual sanctuary where people, in his words, can come to heal the wounds of the alienated lesser self and open pathways to their true self, the greater self. His tireless commitment to peace inspires and informs all of our programs and publications, which include the development of multi-author books examining issues in peace learning and dialogue, a fellowship program to advance research in Ikeda Soka studies, an annual forum for intercultural dialogue, a bi-monthly dialogue event for students and young professionals, and our newest event series, Indigo Talks, which we launched actually last year in 2021. Named after the Buddhist expression from the indigo and even deeper blue, this new lecture series features renowned scholars and dialogue with enduring works by Mr. Ikeda. Just as items repeatedly dyed with indigo turn bluer than the indigo itself, the Chinese allegory of the indigo plant exemplifies the impact learning has on deepening one's wisdom, courage, and compassion. And I know our inaugural Indigo Talk speaker, Dr. Francine Huckabee, is with us today as well. So thank you for joining us. And this year, we are so pleased and honored to have Dr. Johnny Lupinacci as our Indigo Talk speaker. Dr. Lupinacci is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Social Thought and Education at Washington State University. His work as an eco-critical scholar activist in teacher education, environmental education, and curriculum studies contributes to his research on teaching to address the conditions of the Anthropocene in K-12 schools and higher education. He is co-author of the book Eco-Justice Education and is on the editorial boards for Educational Studies, Critical Education, and Journal for Critical Media Literacy. Dr. Lupinacci was recognized by the Washington Education Research Association with a research award in 2018. He is also one of the contributing authors of our newest publication, Hope and Joy in Education, Engaging Daisaku Ikeda Across Curriculum and Context. We were first introduced to Dr. Lupinacci through the center's executive advisor, Dr. Jason Gula. From meeting Dr. Lupinacci for the first time on Zoom, to eating the best tacos together in San Diego during the American Educational Research Association conference back in April, to seeing him engage with our youth just this week in a pre-event dialogue, I have been deeply encouraged and inspired by Dr. Lupinacci's passion, warmth, wisdom, love for youth, and truly his heart to treasure and embrace each person he encounters. One of our youth asked Dr. Lupinacci, how can we empower people in a world where, in Kendrick Lamar's words, hurt people hurt more people? Dr. Lupinacci responded, it might be messy and complicated, but if we can go through it together and learn to love one another through it and co-learn together, I hold hope. When we do that, we move from having to change people to having to grow together. The more we do that, the more we will see shifts. So that's just a little preview of Dr. Lupinacci's wisdom. And as you can imagine, we have learned so much from him, and we are very excited for his talk tonight, titled Envisioning a Better World Together Through Value Creation, Interdependence, and Creative Coexistence. Dr. Lupinacci will be exploring ideas from Mr. Ikeda's 2022 peace proposal, titled Transforming Human History, the Light of Peace and Dignity. We will also have an opportunity to engage in dialogue with Dr. Lupinacci after the talk in a Q&A format. So if you have any questions that you'd like to explore with him, please utilize the Q&A box, which you can find down below throughout the event. And so actually, before we jump into the talk, Dr. Lupinacci would love to hear from all of you. So we actually have some questions we'd like to ask you. So actually now my colleague Priyandra will be pulling up our Mentimeter slide. So as you can see here, if you can go to www.menti.com, and you can use the code 32885753. Our first question for all of you today is, what brought you here? So we'll give a few seconds or a minute to hear from everyone. So I believe once you type in the code, you can post your response in a box. So yes. To learn and be inspired. Yes, that's a wonderful reason for attending an Indigo Talk. I think that's why we're here as well as center staff. So thank you. To listen and reflect. Interested in how to envision a better world together. Me too. To learn. Yes, we have many learners, seekers here, curious about this new lecture series and support the Ikeda Center. Thank you for supporting us. Curiosity. Maybe we'll have a few more. Refresh my heart and spirit. I agree. I think that's so needed, especially during these really crazy times. Curious what this event is about, the subject matter. Always want to refresh my peace building efforts, to listen to everyone, foster my capacity as a global citizen. Wonderful. So please, continue to post. But actually, we're going to go to our next question, if that's okay. So in one word, how would you describe how you are feeling about the world today? So we actually did list a little bit with Johnny when we met with our youth. So we wanted to hear just how everybody is feeling today so we can really ground ourselves in today's talk. Sad, concerned, drained, yes. Uncertain, complicated, yes. I think we have a few concerned, as I think the word is a little bigger than the other ones. Worried, we have an optimistic folk, yes. Displeased. Thank you so much. I know it's such a mixed bag of emotions these days, and I'm happy that hopeful is getting bigger and bigger at the center. So thank you so much, everyone. So yes, with that, I was just thinking, thank you so much, Pri, for sharing the Mentimeter slide. And actually, as the words were coming in, I was remembering an interview that my colleagues Henri Tanabe and Mitch Bogan did with Dr. Lupinacci, where he said, hope doesn't go away just because pain is present. And so I was thinking, with all of our emotions and feelings that you shared today, I'm also excited to feel hope and joy through Dr. Lupinacci's talk. And so actually with that, I would like to invite him to join us on this Zoom screen to give tonight's Indigo Talk. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lupinacci.
Thank you, Lillian. That's quite the introduction. And thank you all for attending tonight and for sharing how you're feeling, especially because while talks like this tend to be cerebral, as often as we can to connect with our emotions, which is really hard to do through Zoom. And so thanks for starting at that kind of place. I'm going to do a little bit of a screen share here. So bear with me, and then we'll get right into things. Let's see. And so I think we're set there. Hello, and thank you all for welcoming me to this conversation, and in these unprecedented times, to be able to connect with you all through the Ikeda Center and to participate in the Indigo Talks is truly an honor. Today, we're going to have a bit of a lecture, of course. I mean, it's a talk, but really this lecture will be more of what I'd like to say is more of a dialogue, because while I'll be sharing some ideas and thoughts about Daisaku Ikeda's 2022 peace proposal through the lens of my work as a teacher and teacher educator, together we'll explore Ikeda's concepts of value creation, interdependence, and creative coexistence as a way to bring forth hope and joy in these times of suffering. Most importantly, we'll be having a discussion centered more appropriately on envisioning a better world together and positioning value creation and interdependence as keys to learning together to value creative coexistence. And if I can break that down a bit today briefly, I will by simplifying two very important concepts. And those two very important concepts are diversity and interdependence. I find it to be helpful to approach these kinds of talks with having an open-ended and hopefully informative dialogue that shares stories, thoughts, and ideas, but also culminates with how we might take action in academic settings and our broader communities in support of what we are learning about radically while working toward peace, while reminding one another that peace is not passivity, and that we are convening this evening knowing that everyone here has witnessed most recently the largest social uprising of all of our lifetime, and that we can take great hope in the energy that youth are carrying forward from the resistance movements, both global and local. But more so, my goal for what we share here today is for this to be one of many points of connection for our communities to grow together. For this event to be an authentic invitation to continued dialogue centered on learning and growing together wherever we are at in this kind of work, and however it is we identify in relationship to Daisaku Ikeda's work. I want to say in full transparency that I don't identify as an expert or even a scholar who specializes in Ikeda's work, but rather as a scholar, activist, educator in dialogue with some brilliant and inspiring folk who continue to invite me to read more and to be in conversation with friends who bring Daisaku Ikeda's work to critical and generative discussion about how we might impart joy and work together to recognize the value creation process and the possibilities that emerge when we organize, connect, and build communities around what Ikeda and the most recent peace proposal refers to as, quote, our shared responsibility to the future, end quote, and the importance of a global consciousness of solidarity, economies that offer hope and dignity, taking action to overcome the climate crisis, the abolishment of nuclear weapons, and together with these, for me as a scholar, activist, educator, and teacher educator, how all these aforementioned points discussed in the 2022 peace proposal come to life for teachers and all of us who support education through working together to provide a healthy learning environment for all children, regardless of their race, gender, sexuality, ability, or citizenship. Before I get any further into this conversation and introducing myself, there are some important concepts for considering the political responsibilities for any, but especially discussion of peace in this moment. We are living in times where undeniable atrocities of poverty, sexism, ableism, ageism, together with speciesism, and furthermore, the interrelated nature of these forms of oppression, with resulting conditions like climate change, famine, war, mass incarceration, and an overall failure by world governments to respond to a global pandemic or to unjust suffering from continued global conflicts. And the fires of wars are raging right now as we're speaking. But given such stark conditions, there is hope. And so I'll begin with that hope in the form of gratitude. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this very unique forum and the continued dialogue. And included in that thank you, I'd like to recognize the incredible support and leadership from friends and accomplices in justice work from the folks at the Ikeda Center. Henri, Lillian, Pri, Mitch, Kevin, and then more specifically, my scholar friends in academia who inspired this work, Jason Gula and Melissa Bradford, who for years now have been sharing important lessons about hope and joy in education through Daisaku Ikeda's work and Soka education. And to any of the folks who are working at incredible lengths to keep the kind of programming that the Ikeda Center offers thriving, thank you. These kinds of talks are not only enrichment to already robust curriculum and professional commitments that we all have to examine deeply and critically, what I like to refer to as how we grow as learners leading learners. But these moments we are having together also encourage us to connect with one another and seek out healthy and justice-oriented ways to collaborate with diverse communities towards a sustainable and just future. So thank you, organizers, and thank all of you attending on Zoom. And to any of you watching the recording, I hope this talk today sparks critical dialogue that ignites ideas that get shared and woven throughout our communities. Because together we can and ought to be in dialogues that focus on how we make our communities better places for everyone, and how a more beautiful, happier, healthier region and world begins each and every day with you, me, and with what we all do with intention and attention to ending the kinds of beliefs and practices we often learn in schools and carry with us into our work and careers that contribute to racial injustice, rampant sexism, and the spread of disease, poverty, the raising of forests, the factory farming of our plant and animal kin, and the many ways that the violences of oppression are woven into all of our lives. So as learners leading learners, or dare we call ourselves scholar activist educators, or just teachers, with hope for peace, if we share a desire for a sea change to see change, then we brace ourselves for the difficulty and dangers of these changes in current times, and together we make it happen. In solidarity with such an effort, and before we get any further into things, I'd like to continue by expressing my utmost gratitude for the indigenous people of the lands on which, no matter where we are zooming in from on the planet, we are all on indigenous land. And for any of us here, while we ourselves may not be indigenous to these lands, it's important that we recognize our privilege to have these critical conversations. And with that, we recognize that diverse indigenous peoples around the world have survived and continue to endure genocide, both on our home continents and abroad. And that beyond any customary land acknowledgement, we must all continue to work toward decolonial futures as we do this work. Furthermore, as we talk together today, and I share a bit about teaching to recognize and value interdependence bioregionally and broader as our work reaches out across nation-state borders, I hope that most of all, we make unique and lasting connections here among one another with how we'll reimagine through our capacities for value creation that honors diversity and the importance of human rights, as well as ecological well-beings in times where there are loud voices and violent actions being taken by authoritarian leaders and lawmakers, climate change deniers, massive attacks on reproductive rights, anti-immigration policies, human and white supremacist police states, misogynists, and in general, just sometimes folks who identify as good folk, either misled or misinformed as to the importance of diversity. So let me share a key definition that draws from the Buddhist concept of dependent origination and is key towards any discussion of how we learn to recognize and value interdependency. Diversity is a condition of difference upon which everything exists. Nothing comes into existence outside of its relationship to other things. Given the global political moment of 2020, 2021, and as we started off, 2022, and we're in it, especially from where many of us here are at in the US right now, with such a rise in the anti-Blackness, mass incarceration, consumerism, and corporate tyranny, I take the position that we as teachers, and some of us also as researchers and community organizers and leaders in general, ought to be working on all fronts to ensure that schools become places of sanctuary from injustice, in sites where all of our children are learning to live in communities that are rooted in human rights and environmental health. A day doesn't go by that I don't hear directly from teachers or peer researchers or students in our classrooms that there is a chilling effect right now in our schools and communities. And they ask, how do we find energy to continue this work when there is so much suffering? And to that, I often respond. We find energy or determined hope in the agency we have to respond to the suffering in ways that provide relief, for not only relief in that moment, but in radical ways for the future. We begin by recognizing our shared capacities for responding to suffering and to the shift of power that occurs when we see that our own health and happiness is bound up in the suffering of others. In Ikeda's peace proposal, he shared an episode from the Vimalakirti Sutra, where Vimalakirti was ill, but he wasn't suffering from any specific illness. Rather, his empathy and shared pain existed as illness as long as others were suffering without relief. Vimalakirti described this by saying, and this is a quote, "Because all living beings are sick, therefore I am sick." The world is suffering tremendous amount of unjust harm being done to one another, and furthermore, diverse species on the planet are suffering, as well as many of these diverse species are suffering to the point of extinctions. Many of us feel ill. And while I am not suggesting that illness or exhaustions are not real, I am suggesting that there is wisdom in Ikeda sharing the lesson shared by Vimalakirti, that not only might we be sick because so many around us are suffering, but that the converse of the statement may also be true. Because all living beings are sick, therefore I am sick, is also true. Or maybe because I am sick, therefore all living beings are sick. I find it quite useful to look at that converse. Because I am sick and suffering, therefore all living beings are sick and suffering. In other words, the crisis of the world suffering right now are in major part because of a political majority of cultural assumptions imposed on the world. In other words, I'm suggesting that many of the problems threatening the Earth's capacity to support human life and standing in the way of abolishing colonialism, racism, sexism, etc., is stemming from a cultural sickness deeply rooted in assumptions about individualism in conjunction with human white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and ableism. And it's suffering that's causing vast suffering. However, those in power with political majority, although they are a small group in comparison to those who suffer unjustly from their sickness, don't see their illness as such. And our efforts to provide relief or alternative is often met with great resistance. In 1963, James Baldwin, addressing teachers and school leaders in a talk to teachers, said, and this is a quote, "Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. We are in a revolutionary situation. No matter how unpopular that word has become in this country, the society in which we live in is desperately menaced from within. To any citizen of this country who figures themselves as responsible, and particularly to those of you who deal with the minds and hearts of young people, must be prepared to go for broke. Or to put it in another way, you must understand that in attempt to correct so many generations of bad faith and cruelty, when it is operating not only in the classroom, but in society, you will be met with the most fantastic, the most brutal, and the most determined resistance. You simply cannot in this moment you cannot simply in this moment not acknowledge the tremendous power, privilege, and responsibilities we all have in bringing our best for humanity and for all of us going for broke in this moment. I'll come back to Baldwin in a little bit when we close out, because in particular, the talk to teachers is incredibly timely for us all. But centering back now on gratitude, I hope that we can recognize that among us today, there are diverse allies and accomplices across many cultures, and that there are also many missing from being here with us, and that we express our gratitude for those who leverage their lives and freedoms to take direct action and dissent against the cruelty of disease, war, mass incarceration, criminal injustice, climate change, police brutality, and the multitude of ways that colonization, slavery, and racism combine with sexism classism, and ableism rooted in human supremacies, and how those fuel the unjust suffering of oppression and fester as the roots of our human hubris in regards to how we treat ourselves, one another, and respond to climate change. So I'm going to draw on Ikeda to define a few things today, like interdependence and creative coexistence. But let me do a little bit of an introduction and then on to the definitions. And then I'll share some steps I might suggest as action in support of the 2022 peace proposal. And then we'll move on to the best part, the dialogue, also known as the Q&A, specific to your thoughts and inquiries, or what I like to say is the part of the dialogue where the magic happens. So I think in these kinds of talks, it's generally customary for the speaker to tell you a bit about themselves. And I'll do a little bit of that. I'm Johnny Lupinacci, a scholar, activist, educator at Washington State University, an associate professor in the Cultural Studies and Social Thought and Education program here in the United States. An activist teacher from Detroit, now transplanted to the Pacific Northwest of the continent. I'm truly grateful for a growing community of activist scholar educators around the world. Special for me to be with you all today because you all come from different disciplines, and as an artist and activist kid in Detroit who grew up loving mathematics, I became a math and science high school teacher who then spent many summers teaching math, anatomy, chemistry, biology, but more specifically preparing my students for a myriad of career tracks and their often first-generation journeys to becoming nurses, doctors, researchers, teachers, social workers, gardeners, artists, parents, and some now professors. I was also teaching social studies and specifically social and environmental justice through science and mathematics in what we now call learning gardens and urban farms, all as part of a critical hip hop youth activism centered on community empowerment towards local food sovereignty as a pathway towards a healthier local economy and community liberated from slavery and exploitation. But all that landed me in a very special PhD program in urban education that was visionary and transdisciplinary in training researchers that were scholar activist educators who were community-based and trained to meet a very specific political, social, economic, and environmental need in Detroit. And I would group in with Detroit nearby industrial Rust Belt cities like Flint, Toledo, Pontiac. The need was holistically bringing all hands on deck to research and organize together how we could get to be a healthier community. More specifically, the need was to bring nursing educators, K-12 teachers, community activists, and organizers together with artists in an interdisciplinary program that would share seminars and core courses that were focused on a healthier, diverse community. It was about recognizing the importance of diversity in who came to solve common problems and how we might really get from talking the talk to walking the walk if we put down our habits of knowing what's best and generatively and together with communities asked questions and sought out answers in diverse ways and found wisdom in unconventional but often obvious places. It was nothing short of visionary because, as we all know, we all tend to spend too much time deep in our own silos of thought. For example, teachers with teachers, teacher educators who were once teachers themselves with other teachers, nurses with other medical professionals, social workers with social workers, educational researchers with other researchers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's simply not how our communities work or how things work in a forest or a wetland. It's the diversity of ideas and skills that bring strength to not only our living systems, but a rich boon of timely and bioregionally responsive organizing. Not only that we as human beings all do, nothing that we all do as human beings in the world operates in isolation from society and the politics of that society. So while our professional needs as teachers, scholars, researchers, or wherever you are at coming to this talk have very specific skill sets that differ and are unique to our jobs, we must also be able to see the bigger picture and more so the importance of cultural and biological diversity in not only our learning spaces, but in our research projects and all of our endeavors, but also thriving in our ecosystems and communities. I'm here speaking with you today because of the lessons I learned and continue to be learning from through my relationship to places and the diverse relationships, experiences, and shared suffering in Detroit, in the US, and around the world. So overall, as an activist educator, the key inquiry I have guiding all my work is asking and examining the questions: what is the role of education in our society? What ought to be the role of education? Furthermore, asking, given such ideas like public education, democracy, human rights, and sustainability, who and or what benefits and suffers in our schools? In general, there is simply too much unnecessary and unjust suffering in both human and more than human communities. But I mentioned something before about diversity and definitions. I think it's important to have some shared working definitions for any learning together. And it doesn't mean that those are fixed or perfect, but they help us push a little at where theory and practice come together and make change. So let's move to some definitions. I like to say often that diversity is a condition of difference upon which everything exists. In other words, nothing comes into its existence outside of its relationship to something else. And often it's many other things. This means diversity, as I mentioned before, is a condition of difference upon which survival, and beyond that, imperative that our human and more than human individual and community health and well-being relies on. Furthermore, it's paramount for the survival of democracy, for citizens, aka human decision makers, to be able to recognize and value diversity and to see democratic decision making as a way of organizing in support of diversity. We must have strong biodiversity for many reasons. We must also have cultural diversity so as not to monoculturalize, because as languages, rituals, beliefs, understanding, and knowledges are lost, so is diversity. And this directly threatens a fundamental condition we ought to be valuing with extreme care. Diversity is a condition of our existence. Without capacity and faculty to recognize and value diversity, then, well, quite frankly, we don't have much hope. But remember, I hold hope because diversity is abundant and here all around us. And we as human decision makers just simply need to learn to better recognize, value, and honor its importance. It's always there. Okay, so I've defined diversity, and specifically at this moment, the largest social uprising in all of our lifetimes, with brilliant leadership from civil rights leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement, youth activists like the global youth activism to address climate change, or indigenous resistance efforts to protect water and land. We are seeing in mass right now truth being spoken to the ill powers of a cultural norming of domination and exploitation. But as we build up to what this all has to do with learning to recognize the relationship between diversity, interdependence, and creative coexistence, while we're doing definitions, let's be sure we have a common understanding of concepts that might help us connect dots across things that are causing unjust suffering in our communities right now. For example, the connections between racism, sexism, and speciesism. Here are some quick reference definitions that, of course, are limited, but can help us to set up a foundation to work from here and build, because I often worry that if we aren't careful about how we move to how we organize around interdependency and creative coexistence, we might gloss over or make assumptions about the very real material suffering happening among us in our human communities that is deeply intertwined with addressing how we all might move forward towards a diverse, bioregionally organized, multi-species democracy or creative coexistence. given the political moment in my locale and teaching and researching together with the political leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, and global resistance movements to climate change, I'll start with something I think is actually really helpful in a number of places around the world right now. Racism can be understood as racial prejudice plus power. Okay, racial prejudice combined with power. Similar to racism, sexism can be understood as prejudice plus power. By power, I mean discrimination of any person or group based on their race or any other socially constructed category like gender, by a person or a group or people in political power. For example, white folks may experience poverty and even some discrimination or prejudice, and certainly some unjust suffering in some spaces. But it isn't and cannot be racism. Racism is prejudice or discrimination enacted by an individual or group in political power. Again, similarly, this is like how it's not sexism when a male identifying or identified person is discriminated against, because most often this is occurring within larger patriarchal systems. Now, I'm not condoning the mistreatment of anyone or saying that discrimination is something we want to perpetuate, but it's simply not in every case racism or sexism. If it's happening to a person who identifies and or is privileged by being identifiable to a political group in power, like a white male. So while anyone can express prejudices or even discriminate unfairly or commit acts of violence, it isn't racism or racist unless it's racial discrimination based on the inferiorization of a race by someone or a group in political power. So similar and related, speciesism grows specifically in cultures that have strong anthropocentric or human-centered foundations, in which human beings understand themselves as superior beings in relation to all other species. And so while as humans we are bound to understanding the world through our human experience, the assumption that our experiences are only knowledge or the best truths leads to a culturally constructed sense of superiority that sets up a problematic culture-nature binary in which human needs, rights, identities are separate from and superior to all other things. If this is the foundation from which we as humans understand our existence and it guides our decision-making, then we operate in a speciesist framework through which all that needs to be done in order to rationalize or justify the unjust treatment of other humans is to liken them to nature via connections to animals, insects, or land. Okay, so we can see how there's a relationship across these isms. If human supremacy is a foundation, then racism, sexism, and other socially constructed value hierarchies are enforced via likening any other being as less than human and therefore a resource to be exploited, dominated, or used with little or no limitation. That said, and before we jump to how I work with teachers specific to empowering all of our students and including diversity in that empowerment, another key concept here is systemic oppression, or the ways that racism, sexism, and speciesism and other forms of oppression can be understood as something unfair, harmful, even deadly, keeps happening over and over and over and over to a group of people or species because of their race, how they identify, their abilities, diverse sexualities, religions, or ethnicities, or how their existence is reduced to being a resource or commodity for human societies. For example, this last part, we needn't look too far to see that our food systems, and we see within those food systems, maybe the most intimate relationship we all have of what we put into our body, food and water, to see the atrocities in our waterways and in the meat and dairy industries, as well as the factory farming of salmon, soy, or any living being, which includes plants. We call that time and time again, that kind of violence, systemic oppression. So here we are. And the schools where we teach and learn and the communities that we organize in and work in and live in, we are learning together to be learners leading learners. And it's within these spaces of interest that I have, because these are places where systemic oppression is occurring. And this often includes, but too often includes, our schools, our community organizing centers. And sadly, they are often places where racism, sexism, and these isms exist. But it's deeper than just the individual events in schools or the actors within them. Although those matter because they add up and they never happen outside of their relationships to systemic oppression, I think it's really important to see the connections between individual acts and systemic acts. When I'm working to build capacity to value create in ways that recognize the agency we have as humans to support our capacities to recognize or value create and value interdependency, I use this figure as a heuristic for visualizing what I refer to as two important concepts offered in this work from ecofeminism. The first is a logic of domination, where I contrast human-centered worldviews with diverse ecological worldviews, and with that image up, discuss race and racism, sex and sexism, diverse abilities and disabilities and ableism, and with that speciesism in our human relationships to other species. Further looking at cultural results of a particular kind of hyper-individualistic patriarchal human-centered worldviews, the second figure I'll share here depicts how such a logic structure leads to what ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood calls an illusion of disembeddedness. This image helps us to recognize the ills of understanding ourselves as disconnected from one another and the ecological world and diverse species our health and existence is dependent on. Remember the lesson Ikeda shared in the peace proposal that I shared in the beginning of the talk, where we emphasize that our suffering is inextricable from those suffering around us? And that I extended that to suggest that some of our suffering in the forms of understanding ourselves as an illusion of disembeddedness may in fact be the cause of so many others' suffering. Specifically then, in my work, we are learning to utilize our capacities to value, create in favor of diversity, interdependence, and we community build through our desires and actions to support creative coexistence. I describe this process as recognizing, resisting, and reconstituting assumptions, beliefs, and practices. So this framework is applied to what I, together with some of my colleagues and accomplices, refer to as an eco-critical framework towards a praxis that for me focuses on working through teaching and sort of pedagogical praxis, but it always includes a variety of decolonial work, restorative justice work, abolitionist teaching, abolitionist work, multi-species justice, and so many diverse efforts. Simply put, it's through such an examination that educators can work to support learners in recognizing two conflicting and foundationally different worldviews. On one hand, ecological worldviews supportive of creative coexistence. And on the other, I'm going to go back and forth between these images. On the other, a human supremacist worldview informed by a hierarchical, capitalist, racist, and patriarchal set of relationships. Ikeda scholar who's with us here today, Jason Gula, drawing on Fujita's work on kyosi, or coexistence, as defining it as, and this is a quote, peaceful symbiosis, coexistence, or co-living, shares the quote, is a basic value for social and human security, peaceful social order and daily life activities, and social solidarity, as well as for us, as well as for sustainable economy and society. It is the value that tends to be considered a natural given and not necessarily recognized as important when and where it is maintained and enjoyed by most of the people. And Gula further explains how Ikeda relates this concept, stating, and this is a quote, each individual being functions to create the environment that sustains all other existences. All things are mutually supporting and interrelated, forming a living cosmos, what modern philosophy might term as a semantic whole, right? So here we have Gula sharing Ikeda's sort of conceptualizing this importance of interdependence and symbiosis through this concept kyosi, which we can understand translated through creative coexistence. And I look at this diagram and think, juxtaposing these two very different ways of orienting ourselves and understanding our relationships. The concept of creative coexistence, together with learning to recognize and value our interdependency, is something I see as central to efforts we might take to address what Ikeda suggests in the 2022 peace proposal. It is important for educators, organizers, really any of us in community, to simultaneously learn to recognize how diverse worldviews rooted in interdependence and multi-species equity exist and have much to offer, while also learning to recognize how the power-knowledge relationship works right now in capitalist, patriarchal, white, cis, hetero, human supremacist cultural worldviews. Let's take a look at that again. I know we're pretty familiar with it because it's kind of the dominant framework through which most of our relationships experience definition. This comparison functions to disrupt anthropocentrism and human supremacy, combining with an illusion of individualism through examining how such a worldview might be reconstituted via changing how we teach or organize or relate to ourselves and one another in ways that are local and in support of living systems. By highlighting how many of the dominant cultural belief systems, root assumptions, and narratives currently destroying the planet and prospects of peace are constructed and are not simply natural, the idea is that we can help ourselves and one another develop critical perspectives on these root beliefs. This undertaking also allows for the exploration of alternative belief systems and metaphors that facilitate different kinds of relationships with other people, other beings, and the land. Ultimately, addressing unjust suffering in society is important, but it must also include an awareness and analysis of the impact of any proposed solution on several generations of both human and more than human communities. Okay. The more we, as learners leading learners or as teachers, engage in diverse efforts towards more just and sustainable futures, the more models we will have that encourage the recognition of and resistance to all forms of domination. Furthermore, the more potential there will be for community organizing around learning together in ways that support educational experiences that foster spaces where we all learn together to recognize the harmful assumptions and actions of human supremacy, like only learning from other humans as something that will hinder our collective work towards valuing creative coexistence. Well, on one hand, I admire and value, and I am a firm supporter of a shared commitment to respond to the undeniable atrocities that we as humans enact on one another, like, for example, how important anti-racist and feminist pedagogies are to just futures. These atrocities are inextricably connected to the cruelties we perpetuate against non-human animals and the environment. None of these atrocities occur in isolation. They are all interconnected. This is why I push us broadly to take an uncomfortable step to confronting human supremacy together with other forms of supremacy in our organizing and our community building together. One powerful takeaway from Ikeda's work is that the uncomfortable step is part of the process. In doing so, it is paramount that anyone interested in or doing this kind of work as committed allies or accomplices to those suffering while challenging and confronting the systemic roots of oppression on all our respective fronts, is that we're clear that this work is to both address immediate ways human communities are suffering while centering inquiry on all beings' interdependencies and interconnected rights and needs. In other words, we all have a responsibility, many of us as privileged members of society, to support those, including our more than human kin, who are suffering unjustly in whatever capacity we can, while recognizing that solutions to end suffering must not include unsustainable exploitation of one another and the more than human world. Inspired by movements to address unjust suffering for our human and more than human kin, like the 2022 peace proposal, I am suggesting that it is utmost importance that we listen to and learn from social movements and the activist leaders like the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, the women's revolution in Rojava, the water protectors on occupied native territories, together with taking some actual steps in our studies and enactments of pedagogies in our classrooms and community organizing toward cultural change. Although I recognize the importance of localized responses and understandings, concluding, I'll share some preliminary suggestions for what we may begin to do to take action in solidarity with the peace proposal in our lives and in our efforts to community build around envisioning a better world together and taking action towards those futures. 1, engage in community building that explores diverse projects to rethink dominant assumptions, influencing how we as humans construct meaning and thus how we learn to relate to each other in the more than human world. Ask questions like, what does it mean to refer to natural gas and oil reserves as natural resources? What are we ignoring when we commodify the environment this way? What language further perpetuates social inequality and undermines human rights in our communities? Furthermore, ask, what does it mean to be human being? And researchers, or as teachers or community organizers, or whatever it is we do in our diverse communities of life, ask who and what benefits and who and what suffers. How is our research influenced, or how is our work influenced by cultural assumptions that are deeply political? Engage in critical and ethical examinations of community, unapologetically and embracing utopian impulses. Ask who and what might we be ignoring when we think about who is considered in decisions in our neighborhoods or communities, what animals and plants live and make homes in our neighborhoods, and how are we interrelated and interdependent with them? How are we dependent upon these animals and plants and each other? What are we doing to practice reciprocity with our diverse human and more than human neighbors? Engage and examine our communities in terms of interdependency and the diverse ways in which our living relationships can be recognized, respected, and represented through listening and learning from and among all members. Again, how might we learn and teach from the Black Lives Matter at School resources? Or what might it be like to be a student or teacher or community organizer or activist in Rojava? How might we learn in the forest or waterways of our local communities? What might we learn from the relationship we have with our food? Engage in supporting the diverse approaches to taking up resistance and healing from Western industrial culture, and in solidarity, show respect for cultural knowledges that differ from the current dominant discourses in industrial culture. Above all, and in addition to the attempts to disrupt the systemic oppression that is perpetuated through and within educational spaces and community organizing at the individual level, we can also commit to the daily effort of building a conscious capacity for and practice of value creating through the imaginative process of unapologetically imagining what creative coexistence might look like in our communities. Imagine often and dream big, embrace the utopian impulse and do so with attention and intention to interdependency and creative coexistence. Finally, return to the moment from those dreams, determined with the most fantastic energy to make critical friends with other humans and non-human animals, engage with adversaries, and sharing stories of hope, joy, and resilience while critiquing local and international relations of domination and hierarchies. In such volatile authoritarian times, it's important that we all have thoughtful dialogues with others that call into question dominant perceptions of what currently constitutes what we learn, our schools, education, and knowledge, and with invitation to collectively imagining with open hearts and minds what's possible. And I'll end, as promised, by coming back to Baldwin, who in that same talk to teachers said, the obligation of anyone who thinks of themselves as responsible is to examine society and to try and change it and fight it at no matter what risk. This is the only hope society has. This is the only ways societies change. Now, let's move to the discussions, the conversation, and the continued dialogue. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Johnny, for such a thought-provoking and energizing talk. I loved Imagine Often and Dream Big, and it really reminded me of Mr. Ikeda's peace proposals, where he always starts out by painting the stark reality of the world, which you did for us, and then really imparting hope and clear ways to take action, which is what you offered us today. So thank you so much, Johnny. So we have questions that came in, and in the interest of time, we may only have time for two, if that's okay, Johnny, but they're great questions. So maybe I can start with the first one. So the first question is, I think referencing, Johnny, your reference of the Bhima story in Mr. Ikeda's peace proposal. So the question is, the suffering in the world is showing itself. Now everyone is sick. How do we begin to heal the sickness?
Yeah, so I think for me, one of the things that sparked that's really helpful is a reminder when I do the converse of the statement. I think that it's the world's social majority has a foundation from which the cure, if we're to think of it as an illness, exists. Another part, it's a world's political or popular minority. So those in power who I'm thinking this sort of illness of individualism, of those value hierarchies that I referred to as illusion of disembeddedness, of that white supremacy, really like male supremacist ideals, colonialism, Eurocentric thought that is really speciesist and problematic. I think that's part where the illness is originating from. And so I have great hope in that the world's 2/3 social majority don't have this illness. They're suffering as a result of the imposed effects of illness. In other words, I don't believe that human beings are flawed, right? None of us are our model of perfection, but we have the capacity, I think, and Ikeda talks about this as value creation, right? We have the capacity and agency to unlearn or to resist that political minority, or the popular minority that have a political power. So to begin to heal from the sicknesses, we begin to, I don't know, quarantine the white supremacists. No, I'm being silly about that, but I mean in metaphor, really. Like we begin to cure where the problem is. It's originating from a particular group of people in power.
Thank you so much, Johnny. Yeah, I loved when you said
changing poison to medicine. I see this in the panel. Yes, like all poison is a little bit of medicine. And so how do we change the poison to medicine?
Yeah, I think Isabel, Johnny, talks about that in Hope and Joy as well.
Absolutely.
And, I love when you said none of us are flawed. It reminds me of Mr. Ikeda often references this Buddhist idea that all of us are fully endowed. So we all have within us, as you said, the capacities to confront the problems that we created ourselves, and how do we begin the healing process from within. So thank you so much. And so our next question is, one second, I think we have a couple. So okay, so how do you describe inclusive education?
Ooh, that's a good question. Because inclusive often is framed in ways that really aren't inclusive. It's like you're included just so long as you're like me or whatever my ideals of what the definition of inclusion ought to be. For me, inclusive education is different everywhere, but some commonalities exist in terms that it's invitational to all those stakeholders, we might say, all those present at the point of connection to one another. So it can look really different. In fact, sometimes inclusive ed wants to standardize things or understand it. I think we need to think radically about what we mean by who will be included and according to what sort of guidelines. So when I think about it, I mean this. I want us to dream and reimagine often what even constitutes education or classrooms or community learning spaces. So it's sort of a multi-species framework. Imagine creative coexistence as a model for inclusion. Too often the human supremacist frame, right, or the colonial Eurocentric idea of what it means to participate in education is how do folks come to the center from the margins. And I think this, like really thinking about interdependency and intrinsic value on all participants helps us to really radically reclaim inclusion from narrow ways of understanding it. There's some interesting stuff, I think, also in folks who are doing multi-species frameworks for learning together and education and thinking of that. A lot of the critical disability community has done wonderful work around us thinking differently, even around things like we talk about voice and participation, and we often only include what's spoken, so really we have to think with open hearts and minds and eyes and ideas to what it means to be included and how participation can be many things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Johnny. In the 2022 peace proposal, I think we might have talked about this a little bit, but Mr. Ikeda writes that we need to create a society where every person can say, I enjoy living in this world. And so when I think about that, I'm like, wow, when I think about inclusivity, I don't think I think about like every person being able to say, they enjoy living in this world, and what would that world look like?
And I think about it too, because we think about that Bill McCarty tale too, the part shared, the story, the lesson, right? And I think about too, like what it means for me to experience joy. And can I, if the waterway is unhealthy, if the forest and the wetland is hurting, if the land, which we know for many of us has experienced violence of colonization, of monoculturalization through crops and things. And so with so much pain and suffering around, beginning to recognize those and changing how we relate and the reciprocity we give as part of that healing process. So sometimes we feel great failure and suffering, even when we're maybe reaching in our community organizing, these woke moments of like, man, I'm really surrounded by some great folks who understand how racism works. They're committed to not reproducing it. They're feminist in orientation. They're queer affirming and recognizing, that, there are a number of ways we can support one another as humans in just ways, but we're still feeling the pain and we're still struggling in this world. And sometimes I think in part, well, I'm not diminishing the work that they're doing to ensure social justice for one another, thinking because simultaneously there is a sickness going into us all the time through our food. And we often might be eating the very violence we're addressing cerebrally or in our social organizing. And so it's like we got to think about all the ways together we may recognize, resist, and reconstitute, and in ways like that illness can go away, right? Because we can't heal from the suffering and put in little band-aids on the wounds we inflict on ourselves and each other.
Wow. Thank you, Johnny, for that. Yeah. This is, I think, in a way, a good segue to what will be our final question for today. Cool. So the question is, in paving a new path or expanding our ways of thinking, we may often face resistance from ourselves and from others, which I think you talked about, the fantastic resistance and the brutal resistance, Johnny. And so the question from this participant is, how do we push through the resistance? And how do you push through the resistance, Johnny?
We talked about this before, not in this talk, but in some of our dialogues. And it's really important to note that all the things we're sharing here today really emerge out of relationships and conversations and discussions. And so this was one that came up a couple nights ago in our youth discussion. This is one that comes up a lot. And so thank you for asking this question. I think a big thing is that we recognize that we have the capacity and agency right? To value create together and in our own senses, but we're never doing it alone. But we have the capacity and agency to do it. So there is always hope where there is resistance, and there is always resistance, and therefore there is always hope. But sometimes it, like we said, it is met with the most fantastic and brutal force. And so I think it's being kind to ourselves and really showing grace and gratitude and taking intentional time and space to care for ourselves and each other together, right? To hold ourselves to the fact that we will make mistakes, that we won't make great change quick, because it is met with the most fantastic resistance. But that together, as we grow strong, right, we begin to see shifts and changes, right? It's like if there's a massive wall and we just keep running into it, the wall might not come down. But if we take breaks to kind of think together, how might we remove this wall entirely? We will together. I have great hope for human capacity together to do different. So that's a big thing. The other thing is allowing for space to hold both joy and suffering, right? Together as different things. Like, we don't have to find joy in suffering. I'm not asking for that. But to say sometimes it's such an either or for us. Like, we're feeling like there's no hope because there's so much sense of suffering. Allow space to feel the suffering. It's also proof that you have humanity, that you feel and you exist and you are present in the moment, right? You're acknowledging, you're recognizing the suffering around us that you're experiencing. And then organize around really resistance to it, and then find the areas, they're around us, where people are reconstituting, where there are efforts to do differently. Find someone to have a meal with, right? To go on a walk with. The other day we said, where the flowers bloom, so does hope, right? Go to the, we're not all people, right? Some of us prefer that solidarity in a meadow, in a field, or by the riverside, but make friends, right? With yourself, with people in your lives, and with more than human agents in your lives, right? The places and the things around us. I find that's super helpful. All right. And then some practical notes. Surround yourselves with artists. They have the most fantastic creativity for resistance. So, and for a really long time, they've been thinking in non-absolutes. So they've gained skill and body energy around that balance. And I think that's a very practical one too. Allow for your creative capacities to flow and connect with artists who have similar resistance ideas that you do.
Wow, thank you, Johnny. You know, I was going to ask you in the wrap up to our Q&A and a piece of advice you would give to everybody, but I think you just did that.
That's perfect. Yeah.
And for everybody, you know, actually Johnny is an artist himself. So, you know, maybe some other time, Johnny, we can invite you back to play some music and jam together. So thank you so much again, Johnny, today for just such a wonderful talk. And I think so much for us to think about, you know, and so I think it's so in line with our events, where we like to think of them not as the end point, but the starting point for more discussion, dialogue, self-reflection, value creation. And so thank you for giving us lots of hope and joy today. And so with that, actually, to conclude our event this evening, I'd like to welcome our Executive Director, Kevin Maher, to share some closing remarks. So over to you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Lillian, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. I know we have friends from all over the world, so thank you so much for joining us and participating for our second Indigo Talks event. I want to express my deep appreciation to Dr. Johnny Lupinacci for your timely and inspiring talk this evening, as well as for the invigorating dialogues, and there have been many, both through email and through Zoom, that we've had in the weeks leading up to tonight. And throughout these planning sessions, my hope has been rekindled again and again as we explored through open dialogue what it means to envision a new world together. And I feel deep gratitude for these dialogue sessions and for all that I've learned in the process. And thank you as well to all of our participants who've joined us from at least 10 countries that we could see. And in some cases, very late in the evening or very early in the morning. We're so appreciative that you could join us for this event, and in several cases invited your colleagues and friends to participate as well. Thank you so much for being here and for your wonderful questions and reflections. And in his chapter from the Center's multi-author book, Hope and Joy in Education, Engaging Daisaku Ikeda Across Curriculum and Context, Johnny shares the following statement that I think connects so well with tonight's discussion. He writes, hope, as Ikeda states, is a decision, an action to refuse passivity and to recognize that we have it within our human capacities to remedy the current trajectory that industrial human thought and behavior have us on. And he continues, I find great hope in the wisdom and capacity of Earth's diverse species to facilitate healing should we let trees, plants, fungi, animals, insects, and humans get to work living in accordance with the planet. So in short, I have great hope, but it is hope that is closely coupled with action. And I feel that tonight's talk emphasis it speaks directly to this active form of hope. And just as Johnny shared in his presentation, to envision a better world, it requires immense passion, inclusion, and a commitment to living a life of creative coexistence and value creation. And I appreciate this emphasis that we both envision and create this new world together. Each of us is essential in this task, and our combined visions and action to make it so is what will create a shift from a culture of war and violence to one of peace and coexistence. In a collection titled Hope in a Dark Time, that's edited by David Krieger, Mr. Ikeda has an essay titled Our Power for Peace, where he discusses imagination and hope. He writes, imagination is a wellspring from which hope flows. It is the power of imagination, the power to imagine different realities that frees us from the mistaken notion that what exists now is all that will ever exist and that we are trapped inside our problems. He continues, the power of imagination is also the power of empathy. It is the ability to imagine, the willingness to feel the pain of others. It is the spirit that says, so long as you are suffering, whoever you are and whatever your suffering may be, I suffer also. This connects so powerfully with what Johnny shared tonight. Mr. Ikeda continues, he says, the scale of our empathy, reaching out to those in distant places, to people whose lifestyles and language may be different from our own, is the scale of our humanity. A life of true fulfillment is one marked by the nonstop effort to expand and deepen one's humanity. And our capacity to feel the pain of others is perhaps the surest gauge of where we stand in that ongoing effort. And so, again, I want to appreciate all of you for joining us this evening. And as a final note, related to the publication of Hope and Joy in Education, we wanted to share that for a limited time, Teachers College Press, who published the book, is offering a 15% discount and free shipping on domestic orders purchased from the TCP website. And you will see a link in the chat. And to receive this special discount, use the code Ikeda May when placing orders. So again, thank you so much for joining us this evening for a wonderful, wonderful event. Please stay tuned for a write-up on the event and updates on future events in the weeks to come. So please stay safe and be well. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you once again, everybody. Just as Kevin shared, we hope to see you again at our next virtual event. And yeah, please stay tuned for our write-up on our website, or you can follow us on social media at Ikeda Center. So thank you. Have a wonderful evening and day ahead. So see you again next time.